The ships arrived without warning. They drifted into the harbour at Messina. Sails torn, decks silent. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. But as the dock workers climbed aboard, they found something no one was prepared for. The men were either dead or dying. Their bodies were covered in dark swellings, their skin discolored, their breathing shallow and erratic. Some were still alive, barely. Others had already been dead for days, and whatever had happened to them was already spreading. Within hours, the first signs appeared in the city. A fever that came without warning, pain that spread through the body, fast and without mercy. Then came the swellings. Dark, swollen lumps beneath the skin, appearing in the neck, the armpits, the groin. People began to collapse in the streets. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Doctors tried everything they knew, and nothing worked. At first, it seemed like an isolated tragedy, a sickness carried by a single ship. But within days, more ships arrived, and the same story repeated itself. The harbours filled with silence, the streets filled with fear, and slowly, the city began to understand what it was facing. Not an illness, not a passing outbreak, but something far worse. Something that had already travelled thousands of miles and was only just beginning. The ships that arrived in Sicily did not begin their journey there. They had come from the east, from the Black Sea, from a trading port known as Kaffa, a place that today sits in modern-day Crimea, along the southern coast of Ukraine. In the 14th century, it was a vital gateway between Europe and Asia, a place where merchants, soldiers, and goods moved constantly between continents. But in the years before the ships reached Europe, something had already begun. Far beyond the Mediterranean, beyond the great cities of Europe, the disease had been moving silently across the world. Through the vast trade routes of Central Asia, along the Silk Road, stretching from China, through the Middle East, and into Eastern Europe, carried by caravans, by ships, by people who had no idea what they were carrying. Some historians believe it began in the steppes of Central Asia. Others point further east, toward China, where records describe sudden outbreaks of sickness, entire regions struck by an illness no one could explain. Wherever it began, it did not stay contained. Trade connected the medieval world in ways few people understood. Merchants travelled thousands of miles. Goods passed through dozens of hands. Ships carried cargo from one continent to another. And hidden among those cargoes were rats. And on those rats were fleas. Inside those fleas, a bacterium, small enough to go unseen, but powerful enough to change the course of human history. By the time the ships reached the Black Sea, the disease was already moving with them. And in 1346, it arrived at the walls of Kaffa, a city on the edge of Europe, facing the vast lands of Asia, where a siege was underway. An army outside the city, already infected, a city inside, still unaware of what was coming. And from that moment, the course of the outbreak changed, because the disease was no longer traveling slowly along trade routes. Now, it had a direct path into Europe. By the time the ships reached Sicily, the Black Death was not a new disease. It had already been moving across the world for years. Far to the east, entire regions had begun to fall silent. Cities that once thrived along the Silk Road saw their populations collapse. Caravans stopped arriving. Trade slowed. And in some places, it stopped entirely. In parts of China, records speak of sudden and devastating outbreaks, communities disappearing almost overnight, villages abandoned, fields left untouched. To the south, the disease moved through the Middle East, through Persia, through Syria, through Egypt, following the same routes that connected the medieval world. Not as an invading army, but as something far more difficult to stop. There were no borders it recognized, no warnings, no understanding of what it was. It moved quietly at first, hidden within trade, within movement, within the everyday systems people depended on. And that was what made it so dangerous, because by the time anyone realized what they were dealing with, it was already too late. The world was connected, more than people understood, and the disease was moving through those connections, faster than any message could travel. Long before Europe saw its first case, the Black Death had already proven what it could do. And when it finally arrived, it did not arrive as something new. It arrived as something that had already taken hold. When the disease reached Europe, it did not arrive as something immediately understood. It arrived quietly. At first, it appeared as a fever, a sudden weakness, a sense that something was wrong. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have raised alarm. People continued with their daily lives. Markets remained open. Ships continued to arrive. Trade did not stop. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though whatever had arrived in Sicily might pass unnoticed. But it didn't. The first deaths came quickly, and they came without warning. A man healthy one day, dead the next. A woman complaining of pain, unable to stand within hours. Families watched as loved ones deteriorated in front of them. Not over weeks, not over days, but over hours. The symptoms were unlike anything they had seen before. High fever, violent chills, exhaustion so severe it left people unable to move. And then the swellings began to appear. Dark, painful lumps beneath the skin, growing rapidly in the neck, the armpits, the groin. They became known as buboes. At first they were small, then they grew, and with them, the fear. People began to notice patterns, entire households falling sick at once, neighbors disappearing, shops left unattended, doors closed and never opened again. Doctors tried to understand it. They turned to the knowledge they had. Humours, imbalance, air quality. Some believed it was caused by corrupted air. Others thought it was divine punishment, a sign of something far greater at work. But none of it made a difference, because whatever this was, it moved faster than understanding. Within days, the streets began to change. Fewer people outside, more silence, more fear. And then the bodies began to appear. At first, they were carried away, buried, handled with care. But as the numbers grew, that became impossible. All graves filled quickly, too quickly. And the city began to realize this was not a passing sickness. It was something else. Something that did not stop. Something that did not slow. Something that did not spare anyone. And by the time people understood what they were facing, it was already everywhere. At first, the deaths were counted, recorded, understood as individual tragedies. But very quickly, that became impossible. The numbers rose too fast. What began as a handful of cases became dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Entire streets fell silent. Homes left abandoned. Families wiped out within days. The systems people relied on began to fail. Doctors stopped visiting the sick, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't survive it. Priests, once called to comfort the dying, began to disappear as well. There were simply too many bodies, too many calls for help, too many people dying at once. And soon, there was no one left to respond. The living began to avoid the dying. Neighbors turned away from each other. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Because by now, it had become clear. Proximity meant danger, and the disease showed no mercy. It did not distinguish between rich and poor, between young and old. between strong and weak. If it reached you, it took you. The dead began to outnumber the living. Graveyards filled beyond capacity. New burial grounds were opened, then filled again. Mass graves became the only solution. Bodies stacked together, covered quickly, without ceremony, without names. In some cities, the carts moved constantly, collecting the dead from the streets, from homes, from anywhere they were found, and the sound of those carts became something people would never forget. The collapse was no longer coming. It had arrived. And with it came something even more dangerous than the disease itself. Desperation. Because as the structures of society began to fail, people were left with one question: how do you survive something that no one understands and no one can stop? What began in a single port did not stay there. From Sicily, the disease moved quickly to Genoa, to Venice, to Marseille, carried not by armies, but by trade. Ships continued to sail. Goods continued to move. And with them, the disease. There were no warnings strong enough to stop it. No system of quarantine as we would understand it today. No shared medical knowledge that could explain what people were seeing. And so, the very roots that had made medieval Europe wealthy became the roads of infection. In Italy, some of the first cities to face the full force of the plague were the great commercial centres: Messina, Genoa, Venice. Places deeply connected to the outside world. And that connection had made them powerful. Now it made them vulnerable. The disease entered through the ports and spread inward. At first, there were attempts to respond. People avoided the sick. Officials tried to control movement. Ships were watched with fear. But trade was the lifeblood of these cities. And by the time authorities understood the scale of the danger, the plague was already inside the walls. From Italy, it moved into southern France. Marseille was one of the first major French ports to be hit. And from there, the infection spread inland along roads and rivers. France was already strained by war, poor harvests, and social pressure. The plague arrived in a society that was already weakened. As death spread, the responses varied. Some towns tried to close themselves off. Others turned to prayer, processions, and public repentance. Doctors offered what knowledge they had: herbs, bloodletting, burning fragrant woods to cleanse the air. None of it worked. In Paris, one of the intellectual centres of Europe, scholars tried to explain what was happening. They searched for causes in the skies, in the air, in the balance of the body. Some blamed a conjunction of planets. Others blamed poisoned air. Others still saw it as divine punishment. What they did not have was the one thing that mattered most: an understanding of infection. So even in the most educated circles of Europe, explanation did not become protection. To the west, the disease crossed into Spain. There too, the pattern repeated. Port cities first, then inland towns, then the countryside. The speed was terrifying because it made distance meaningless. A place could seem untouched one week and devastated the next. Kings, clergy, merchants, labourers, all were exposed. And when a disease strikes every class at once, there is no stable centre left to manage the crisis. The Holy Roman Empire, with its patchwork of cities and territories, faced the same fate. German towns and trading hubs saw the plague move through merchant routes and urban networks. Some communities tried to isolate, some tried to regulate burials, some simply lost control. As deaths mounted, panic often rose faster than understanding. And panic needed someone to blame. In many places, fear turned outward. Rumors spread. Minorities and outsiders were accused. Communities lashed out in violence while the real cause remained invisible. That too became part of the plague story. Not just disease, but the collapse of reason under pressure. By the time the plague moved into the Low Countries and northwestern Europe, word had already spread ahead of it. People had heard stories. Entire cities dying, ships arriving full of corpses, villages emptied, mass graves. So yes, in some places, they knew something terrible was coming. But knowing a danger is coming is not the same as knowing how to stop it. That was the tragedy. Warnings travelled through rumour. Merchants, clergy, and official correspondence. But the disease moved through trade itself, and no one yet understood that the same ships, goods, animals, and people that sustained medieval life were carrying death with them. England almost certainly heard reports from the continent before the plague arrived. Merchants crossed the Channel constantly. Church networks connected England to France and beyond. News of disaster would have reached ports and courts long before the disease itself. But what could they do with that knowledge? They did not know it was driven by bacteria. They did not know the role of fleas. They did not know how infection truly moved through crowded, filthy, rat-filled environments. So when the plague landed on the southern coast of England in 1348, awareness did not translate into prevention. It simply meant that fear arrived before the sickness did. And then the sickness came anyway. For centuries, people tried to understand what had caused the Black Death. At the time, they had no way of knowing. They searched for answers in the only places they could. In the air, in the stars, in the balance of the body. Some believed the disease was carried in poisonous vapors, a corrupted atmosphere, spreading from place to place. Others looked to the heavens, a rare alignment of planets, a disturbance in the natural order, something cosmic, affecting the world below, and many believed it was something far more personal, a punishment, a warning, a sign that something had gone wrong, not in the body, but in humanity itself. But none of these explanations stopped the disease, because none of them touched the truth. That truth would not be understood for hundreds of years. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, a microscopic organism, invisible to the people living through it, but devastating in its effects. It did not travel through the air as they believed. Not at first. It traveled through animals, more specifically through rats. Black rats, which lived alongside humans in medieval cities, in homes, in storage, on ships, and on those rats were fleas. Fleas that fed on the blood of infected animals. And when those animals died, those same fleas moved to new hosts, including humans. The bacterium entered the bloodstream through a bite, and once inside, it multiplied rapidly. The immune system, unable to stop it, triggered a violent response. Lymph nodes swelled. Infection spread through the body. And the symptoms that terrified medieval Europe began to appear. The fever, the exhaustion, the pain, and the swellings. Those dark, swollen lumps beneath the skin were not random. They were the body's attempt to fight the infection. But in most cases, it wasn't enough. And as the disease progressed, it became something even more dangerous. In some cases, it spread to the lungs. At that point, it no longer needed fleas. It could move directly from person to person, through breath, through proximity. And when that happened, the speed of the outbreak increased dramatically. What had already been devastating became unstoppable. But even this explanation does not answer everything, because the presence of the bacterium alone does not explain the scale of the catastrophe. Rats had existed before. Fleas had existed before. Human populations had faced disease before, but nothing like this. The Black Death was not the first disease humanity had faced, and it would not be the last. But what made it different was not just what it was. It was where it arrived, and the world it entered. By the mid-14th century, Europe had already been under strain. Years of poor harvests had weakened populations. Famine had reduced resilience. Communities were surviving, but only just. Malnutrition was widespread. Immune systems were already compromised. People were more vulnerable before the disease had even arrived. Cities were growing, crowded, unplanned. Streets were narrow. Homes packed tightly together. Waste was thrown into the open. Water was contaminated. Animals lived alongside people. Rats moved freely through homes, markets, and storage areas. Unseen, uncontrolled. The perfect conditions for disease to spread. And when the plague entered that environment, it didn't just spread, it accelerated. One infected flea could pass the bacterium to a human. One human could become a new host. And in crowded conditions, that chain reaction became unstoppable. But it wasn't just the physical conditions. It was the lack of understanding. There was no concept of bacteria, no knowledge of transmission, no idea that proximity itself was dangerous. People continued to care for the sick, to gather, to live closely together. And in doing so, they unknowingly helped the disease move faster. Attempts to treat it often made things worse. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, burning substances to cleanse the air. None of it addressed the real cause. And time was something no one had because the disease moved faster than any response. In some cases, people showed symptoms in the morning and were dead by night. That speed created something else, fear, and fear changes behavior. People fled cities, carrying the disease with them. They abandoned the sick, left bodies where they fell, stopped trusting each other. And in that environment, the disease didn't just spread physically, it spread socially, breaking down the systems that might have slowed it. Even geography offered little protection. Trade routes connected cities. Roads connected regions. And movement never truly stopped. So while the bacterium was the cause, it was the world it entered that made it unstoppable. A perfect convergence of vulnerability, connection, and ignorance. And once those elements came together, the outcome was inevitable. When the worst of the Black Death began to pass, what remained was a world that no longer looked the same. Entire regions had been emptied, villages abandoned, homes left to decay, fields left unworked. In many places, there were simply not enough people left to maintain the systems that had once held society together. The scale of loss was almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of Europe's population died. In some cities, it was even higher. Half of the people you knew gone. And yet, life did not end. It continued. Slowly at first. Uncertain. Fragile. Because for those who survived, there was no clear path forward. There were too few workers to harvest crops, too few craftsmen to maintain infrastructure, too few people to fill the roles society depended on. And so, Rebuilding did not happen all at once. It happened unevenly. Some regions recovered faster. Others remained quiet for decades. Entire settlements were never rebuilt at all. In parts of Europe, land was simply abandoned. Nature began to reclaim what had once been cultivated, but in the places where people remained, something unexpected began to happen. With so many gone, those who survived suddenly had more access to land, resources, and opportunity. Labor became valuable. For the first time in generations, workers could demand more. Wages rose, restrictions weakened, movement increased, and over time, this began to reshape the structure of society itself. The recovery was not quick. It did not take years. It took generations. In some regions, population levels did not return to pre-plague numbers for over a century. Think about that. A world where the effects of a single event lasted longer than the lifetime of anyone who experienced it. And yet, from that devastation, a new world slowly began to form. Economies shifted. Power structures changed. Ideas evolved. The Europe that emerged after the Black Death was not the same Europe that existed before it. And that raises a question, because if something this catastrophic could happen once, and the world could eventually recover, then what does recovery actually mean? Does it mean returning to what existed before? Or does it mean becoming something entirely different? For centuries, the Black Death has been studied, analyzed, and explained. We understand the bacterium. We understand how it spreads. We understand the conditions that allowed it to move so quickly. And yet, even with all of that, there are still questions that don't fully resolve, because the scale of the Black Death doesn't behave the way we would expect. Yersinia pestis still exists today. It still infects animals. It still infects humans. But it does not produce the same level of devastation. Modern outbreaks are rare, contained, treatable. So what was different then? Some researchers suggest the strain itself may have been more aggressive, more efficient at transmission, more lethal once inside the body. Others point to environmental conditions, a colder climate, changes in ecosystems, large rat populations, and flea activity that may have been far more intense than what we see today. But even those explanations don't fully account for the patterns we see, because not every region was affected equally. Some parts of Europe were devastated, entire cities reduced by half or more, while others experienced significantly lower mortality. Certain regions of Eastern Europe, for example, appear to have been less severely impacted, possibly due to lower population density, less urban crowding, or reduced exposure to major trade routes. In more isolated areas, distance provided some level of protection. And beyond Europe, the picture becomes even less clear. The disease certainly moved through Asia and the Middle East, but the full scale of its impact is still debated As for the Americas, there is no clear evidence that the Black Death reached them at that time. Isolation may have protected entire continents, which raises an important point. The disease did not spread everywhere equally. It followed patterns, connections, vulnerabilities. And that suggests something deeper than just the presence of a bacterium. There's another question. Why did it stop? There was no cure, no coordinated global response, no understanding of how to control it. And yet, over time, the wave passed. One possibility is immunity, that those who survived developed resistance, natural selection. The most vulnerable died. The more resistant survived. Over generations, this may have shifted the population itself. Some genetic studies today suggest that certain immune system traits may have been shaped by the Black Death. In other words, the survivors were not just lucky. They may have been different, better equipped to survive what others could not. We often think of the Black Death as something distant, a catastrophe locked in the past, a different world, a different time. But the systems that allowed it to spread have not disappeared. They've evolved. Today, the world is more connected than it has ever been. People move between continents in hours. Goods travel across the globe in days. Cities are larger, denser, more dependent on complex systems than at any point in history. And we've already seen what happens when those systems are disrupted. Not at the scale of the Black Death, but enough to understand how fragile normal life can be. In recent years, a global outbreak brought the modern world to a halt. Flights grounded, borders closed, cities emptied, supply chains strained, hospitals overwhelmed. Entire economies slowed almost overnight. And that was with everything we have today. Modern medicine, advanced communication, global coordination. Now imagine something different, something faster, something deadlier, a disease with the same characteristics as the Black Death, entering a world far more connected than the one it once devastated. It would not move along trade routes. It would move through airports, through high-speed travel, through systems designed for efficiency, not containment. And in the early stages, it would look familiar. A fever, a cough, a small number of cases. Nothing that immediately signals catastrophe. Until it does, because the danger of events like this is not just the disease itself, it's the delay in recognizing what it is. The time between arrival and understanding. The same gap that existed in the 14th century still exists today. And in a world that moves faster than ever, that gap becomes more dangerous. Because by the time systems respond, the spread is already underway. And the question is not whether we are more advanced. The question is whether we are more prepared. Because history has already shown us what happens when those two things are not the same. History has a way of feeling distant, contained, something we can study, but never truly experience. The Black Death feels like one of those events, a catastrophe from another time, a world that no longer exists, a disaster we believe we have moved beyond. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to draw that line, because the systems that allowed it to happen have never really disappeared. They've only changed. Trade became global. Travel became faster. Cities became larger. Populations became denser. But connection remained. And connection is what made the Black Death possible. Not just the disease, the movement, the networks, the invisible links between people, places, and systems. That is what carried it across continents. And that is what still exists today. The difference is not whether we are connected. The difference is whether we understand the risks that come with it. Because the people of the 14th century were not unaware. They saw what was happening. They heard the stories. They watched entire cities fall. But they did not understand it. And without understanding, there is no control. That is the pattern that repeats throughout history. Events that seem impossible until they are happening. Warnings that seem distant until they are close. And systems that seem stable until they are tested. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a moment where the world was forced to confront its own vulnerability. And what followed was not a simple recovery. It was transformation, a new world, shaped by loss. But that transformation came at a cost. Millions of lives, entire generations, communities that never returned. And even now, centuries later, we are still living in the world that emerged from that event, which raises a final question. Not about what happened then, but about what could happen again. Because if something like this were to emerge today, in a world even more connected than before, would we recognize it in time? Would we understand it fast enough? Or would we follow the same pattern of realizing too late that something has already begun?